Today I'm going to be presenting on Mary Ellen Richmond. Mary Ellen Richmond was born on August 5th, 1861 in Belleville, Illinois. Both of Richmond's parents were from Baltimore families. Her father's name was Henry. Neighbors of Henry suggested that Henry may have been a heavy drinker. April 8th, 1865, on the eve of General Robert E. Lee's surrender to the Confederate Army, Lavinia Harris, which was Mary's mother, died of tuberculosis at 34 years old. Mary Ellen Richmond was the second of Lavinia's 4 children, and Mary was the only child that outlived their mother's short lifespan. Frank, the firstborn, her oldest brother, or what would have been her oldest brother, died within hours of birth. Lavinia's mother was a women's rights activist and promoted voluntary motherhood, which was the abstinence within marriage to better control a woman's reproduction, which was pretty radical for that time. So this, Lavinia's mother, was Mary Ellen Richmond's grandmother. May and George, which would have been Richmond's 2 younger siblings, died within 3 months of birth each. Richmond was raised by her grandmother, the one we discussed earlier as the radical woman that kind of promoted voluntary motherhood. And even before her father died, her father had kind of just dropped off Mary to live with her grandmother, and there were implications that this may have been due to his excessive drinking. In 1868, Henry died of tuberculosis as well, so she was officially orphaned. Mary described her grandmother as her most understanding grown-up relative and a genuine comrade. Mary lived with her grandmother in a boarding house at the heart of Baltimore. It's described that Mary genuinely experienced both poverty and a kind of distancing from her family due to these circumstances. Joanna Concord, Richmond's student and successor later in life, described Richmond's childhood as cruelly hampered. Mary's Aunt Ellen, who also lived at the boarding house in Baltimore with her, was a proofreader, and that was what originally got Mary interested in literature. She attended high school in Baltimore and continued her passion with literature and reading. She moved to New York but became ill and had to move back to Baltimore. In 1880, Mary took a job as a bookkeeper in Baltimore at W.L. Stork and Co. Fine Stationers and Engravers, and assumed financial responsibility over her grandmothers and her aunts and worked there for 7 years. It's kind of implied that this responsibility that she had to take over her family members maybe hampered her originally in her professional work life, just because she felt this sense of responsibility. While she was working there for 7 years and having this responsibility over them, she joined a club called De Vallon Club, which was named after her previous professor, and they discussed literature in a way that, due to women really not going to college, plus Mary's financial limitations, they were unable to go to college. So this experience that the women had in the De Vallon Club gave them probably the closest thing as possible to a college experience in kind of literature or creative writing review. It was when Richmond reassessed in this club Charles Dickens' novels that she awoke her social consciousness. Not long after the literature club disbanded, Mary attended her first service at the Unitarian Church in Baltimore. The Unitarian beliefs were that of a loving deity and the basic goodness in humanity. The religious and social inclusiveness resonated with Mary Richmond. Richmond became involved in the education of youth and adults in the church. You'll see a really big pattern of education and wanting to promote education in successors for Mary Ellen Richmond. In 1888, she joined the charity organization movement after being fired and accused of dishonesty and theft from the job that she'd worked at for 7 years, which fought greatly against her own deep sense of honesty and responsibility. Richmond described this incident to her friends as a big accident that led her to the social work field. Richmond left behind her family obligations, not in an abandoning way, but in a freeing kind of way, in order to allow her to do some of the great work that we know about now. And she opened her life to a larger sense of social responsibility, drawing intellectual support from the company of her friends and mentors and fellow academias. Unlike her mentor John Glenn, who viewed poverty either through misfortune or laziness, Richmond held a more liberal religious premise of poverty, but maintained the ideal that assistance should be privately provided rather than through government influence. Richmond argued that public distribution of private charity would rob recipients of their self-respect and proper pride. Mary Ellen Richmond was trained as a friendly visitor, which in modern days would be considered a caseworker or a case manager. Richmond is known for working in Philadelphia as creating the union between social policy and social casework, as well as grounding the social work professionalism in direct service. She was one of the leaders of the establishment of the professional standards for charity organization societies. She advocated for professional education, like we mentioned earlier, for both paid workers, volunteers, and board members. She urged the utilization of empirical evidence gathered by caseworkers on a basis for framing new social policies and for testing the effectiveness of those policies once in place. So a lot of the foundations that we study to this day when getting our MSW were laid out first by Mary Ellen Richmond so long ago. I was able to get a copy of Mary Richmond's Social Diagnosis, which she wrote in 1719. In this, she attempted to standardize and improve upon weaknesses in the social work field to pass on to future social workers, promoting the importance of education in the social work field. A social diagnosis included possible questionnaires that could be used, as well as the beginnings of what, in my personal opinion, the DSM-5 looks like now. And in the beginning of the book, when you first open it, she discusses the importance of education and passing on her knowledge to future social workers to provide more professionalism in the field. Some of the other books she wrote were A Study of 985 Widows, that was in 1913, What is Social Casework in 1922, Child Marriages in 1925, and Marriage in the State in 1929. This was another one I was able to get my hands on, and it was actually from a legal library. And the text and the way it was written was very much what I would expect to be from a legal professional. So her broad range of education and just the scope of her work was, I would believe, to be really impressive. Some of the other books that she wrote were Friendly Visiting Among the Poor, that was in 1899, which was a handbook for charity workers. In 1908, The Good Neighbor in a Modern City, Philadelphia. 1913, A Study of 985 Widows, known to certain charity organization societies. And then 1922, What is Social Casework? An introductory description. So all of these are really just to pass the mantle on, which was her passion. She identified 6 sources of powers that are available to clients and their social workers. So sources within the household, in the person of the client, in the neighborhood, the wider social networks, and in civil agencies, in private and public agencies. Mary's long list of publications and works prove that her real passion was providing education to future social workers, like we've talked about throughout this entire presentation, and just deeply enhancing the professionalism and the empirical methods used during social work and the social work field as a whole. Mary Richmond very much was consumed by the passion of the job, and her family were her coworkers and her students and all of just her academic family. So she never married or had any children, although in the biography I read of her, it discussed her having options to do so. And she died in New York City in 1928 due to cancer. So this concludes my presentation on Mary Ellen Richman, and I just want to thank you.